maybe let's, before we return to that, maybe it would be helpful to just as a, to table set a little bit. Is the question of President Biden's health, age, or ability to be president a question that you were confronting during the entire course of your time as chief of staff?
Well, you have to parse that. Do each piece of that, and I'll comment accordingly.
Okay. Was President Biden's health a question that you were confronting during your time as chief of staff?
Issues like, when he had COVID, and how we would deal with that, or if he was under the weather.
And President Biden's age, was that a matter that you were dealing with during the entirety of your time as chief of staff?
Yes. The public perception was that he was old, and that factored into his re-election prospects.
And you're asking me to parse, and that's fine. The last one is President Biden's ability to be president of the United States. I will just say, is that linked to the age question that we just talked about? Is that what you were confronted?
No, I think it was different in that the age issue was one of projecting forward into a second term and the public's perception of the president and how that impacted his re-election prospects. There was never discussion about the president's ability to do his job and perform his duties.
But if it was a question regarding his re-election prospects, doesn't that lend itself to being a question about President Biden's ability to serve as president for those hypothetical 4 years?
No, I think it was, you asked about his ability to do the job, and he could do the job. As to projecting forward, there was a perception issue about his age. Was he too old to be a second-term president?
We'll return to the long list of names, but it's your belief that President Biden was able to do the job. Is that a fair characterization of what you just said?
Very certainly so, 100%.
Do you believe that Joe Biden, how long have you known Joe Biden?
Going back to 2009, when I was being interviewed for what became my first job in government, the deputy at the Office of Management and Budget, I met then Vice President Biden during that period of time. That was the first time I met him.
Is it fair to say that you've grown closer over the 16 years since?
For sure.
And when did you, maybe you can just, briefly describe when you went from just having met President Biden to really getting close to President Biden?
When you say close, what do you mean by that? Working closely with him?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Okay. My first job, and it was in part why I met the vice president during the process, I don't know if it was the whole reason, whether he would have been, is that he was asked by President Obama to lead the implementation of the Recovery Act. He had his own team on that, but OMB played a major role in the implementation. So there was a member of my team who was the point on that effort, but I would be in some meetings with the vice president, and he was reviewing the implementation of the act. And then when I became NEC and moved over to the West Wing, I would see him more often and be in more meetings on economic policy.
And I assume that you would meet with President or then Vice President Biden on a pretty regular basis?
Yeah, I would, every couple of weeks on average, I'd be in a meeting with him. Not necessarily that I was leading the meeting, but maybe even more often than that, given Roosevelt room meetings and things of that nature.
And when did that when did that pace increase? When you would see either Vice President Biden or candidate Biden or President Biden, when did that increase when you were seeing it more frequently?
Well, I think it increased, as I said, when I went from being in the old executive office building at OMB to being in the West Wing. And then towards the end of the administration, I spent more time with him. And then not really much time at all until that campaign piece that we talked about that led into the transition. And during the transition, there wasn't a lot of contact.
Okay.
You asked about transitions starting ahead of elections. They do, but at the same time, the discipline is not to distract the candidate.
And is it fair to say that your level of interaction increased tremendously when you became chief of staff?
For sure.
Okay. That wasn't a trick question.
Though there was a fair amount of contact when I was COVID coordinator too.
How often, as COVID coordinator, would you see President Biden?
With a fair amount of frequency, particularly at the beginning, several times a week.
Okay. So you mentioned that you believe that President Biden was able to do the job as president. My question is, looking back over the 16 years that you've known President Biden, do you believe that Joe Biden is able to deliver non-scripted speeches as well as when you first met him?
I think that he's always been a scripted person, so it's hard to sort of differentiate. He's always wanted every word on the page and teleprompters and things of that nature. So I can't weigh in on the delta on that front.
What about scripted speeches? Do you think that that's changed since your time knowing him? His ability to deliver a speech?
Look, I think across time he's had a history of some stumbles. I think those stumbles increased across time, would be my observation, as he's aged.
Do you think Joe Biden, looking back on the 16 years that you've known him, is still able to answer difficult questions from the press in the same way as when you first met him?
I don't think I can sort of benchmark back to then, but at times he, as any leader does, struggles with press questions that can be very difficult questions. So yes, he had some struggles on that front. I don't have a pattern for you on that specific issue.
Looking back over the 16 years that you've known President Biden, do you think his ability to manage his stutter has diminished?
I think the actual stutter I have no view on, but I come back to what I said earlier, that I do think whether it's related to the stutter or not, that he has more stumbling over words and gaffes than he did at the beginning of the term, where I do have a benchmark.
Have you ever, when did you learn, roughly, I'm not going to hold you to the date, when did you learn that President Biden had a stutter?
I don't know if I knew that prior to meeting him. Certainly I knew that during the Obama administration. I think he met with young people who had stutters and helped them, and that's a memory of mine. I don't know when that comes from.
Did you ever actually hear President Biden stutter?
Yes.
Do you, looking back over the 16 years that you've known him, do you think that President Biden's ability to remember dates has changed at all?
I think it's always been a challenge, as it can be for a lot of busy people. He might have that challenge more than others. And I would say, like the stumbling over words, I'd say there's been some trend of that being more common across time.
Same with names?
For sure. Again, I think on names also, it's never been an area of strength for him, but I think it's probably gotten more difficult across time.
same question looking back. Do you think his ability to maintain composure when placed in an uncomfortable situation has remained the same?
I believe so. I mean, I can recall times when he got angry during the vice presidency, and that certainly happened during his administration. I was the subject of it more often because I was in many more meetings with him. I can't judge the overall frequency, but that definitely occurred when he was disappointed.
Looking back on the 16 years that you've known President Biden, do you think President Biden's ability to reliably be awake and alert has changed at all?
I think, again, it's hard for me to benchmark, so I'd rather talk about what I was part of. I certainly, on that, didn't see a trend in my time with him. Occasionally he might nod off a little bit. The job's exhausting, but it was never an issue in terms of, his ability to lead and make decisions.
Did you notice any change in the president's schedule throughout the Biden administration?
The first day not even the first day, as I was leading up for chief of staff, unsurprising to me was we've got to work on the president's schedule. I heard back during the Obama administration, the president's time is the most important asset for a White House, and there's demand for many multiples of his available time. And how do you triage those requests? How do you build in some downtime? How do you make sure that a president has enough time with family? So that pressure was part of my job throughout. And it became more intense with the re-elect.
But did in fact President Biden's schedule change at all in terms of going back to the residence earlier during your time as chief of staff?
There were times when that's one of the policies we tried to implement. There were times when, in order to create the space for him to have some alone time and some, thinking time. So I would say it's more one of the tactics that was deployed throughout my tenure.
I know we said we'd circle back to the names, but just on one of them, I think you mentioned that you had conversations with the First Lady about his schedule. Did the First Lady want his schedule to be lighter?
From the day I came in as chief of staff or leading up to that, one of my meetings was with the First Lady. And she said, I know my predecessor, Ron's been working on this, but she wants to continue to make sure the president has enough time to himself and he's not overscheduled. So that was true before I even started the job.
Did she have concerns about his sleep or health with regard to his schedule?
No, I think it was more just making sure he had time to deal with what is an incredibly stressful job and enough time to, think through issues. She felt like he was overscheduled in terms of the number of events, less so the number of internal meetings and things of that nature.
When you referred to people in the White House telling you to build in more downtime, who approached you with that?
Well, I mentioned that I recall the meeting with the First Lady, Annie Tomasini, the Deputy Chief of Staff, who was really the point person for the president's schedule, knew that was important. And I was aware that the president himself wanted to have more ability to read and think. And, so maybe downtime is the wrong way to capture it. More time that's not in a meeting or on a stage.
Did Mike Donilon also raise similar concerns with you?
I don't have specific recollections, but I would think so.
Okay, we will. Let's return to the long list, and we we talked, I think we just talked about First Lady Jill Biden. But to flesh it out just a little bit more, were there multiple conversations about health, age, or ability to be president? And I can break that down.
It's very difficult when you do it that way.
Okay, that's fair. Let me.
The piece of that where there were conversations was age.
There were multiple conversations about the president's age.
The perception of his age, because it, I don't have perfect recollection here, but I think when you did polls about the president's performance or likability, favorability, or when they started to poll for re-elect, if it wasn't the number one issue, it was one of the very top issues was, is he too old to be a second-term president?
And
so it was a perception issue. So there'd be conversations about how we ensure that he is perceived in the best possible way.
understood. And when you were having conversations about the perception issue of President Biden's age, did you discuss why he was being perceived this way?
I think because he was a man in his late 70s, or then in his early 80s. He looked his age, and being president doesn't help in terms of feeling and looking young.
And I understand physically looking older, but did you ever have conversations about any of President Biden's behavior lending to the perception that he was perhaps too old for the job?
No, I mean, there were always conversations about how long he spoke for. Those date back to prior to being president. So there were topics like that. Can we be shorter and more crisp? There were discussions of should we get him into settings where he's not, how we're dressed today. There were conversations about, makeup and things of that nature.
And I just want the record to be clear. When you're saying that there were conversations, are you speaking about conversations specifically with First Lady Biden or with everybody on this list that we're talking about?
Well, thank you for clarifying. When I think about the limited number of interactions on this topic with the First Lady, my recollection would be that it was on this type of terrain we just talked about. But there were active conversations, across the senior team on this set of issues throughout my time as chief of staff.
Do you think, setting aside age for a moment, that voters were concerned that President Biden was not mentally or cognitively fit to serve as president?
I don't think I have the polling expertise to parse that, if you will. I certainly, as chief of staff, being with him all the time, not all the time, but most days, including in the Situation Room or in the Oval Office, had no reservations about his ability to do the job.
A June 2024 poll that was conducted by CBS YouGov found that, quote, 72% of voters do not believe Biden has the mental or cognitive health to serve as president, as well as nearly half of his own party. What do you make of that?
As I said, I'm not a poll expert. I don't know if that was